Hi, I'm Regina Brinker from Granada High School in Livermore, California. Through the Polar Trek program, a National Science Foundation funded program that partners teachers with researchers in a polar region, I spent about 3 weeks on the Alaskan tundra working with Rose Corey and George Kling from the University of Michigan. The project title is Arctic Sunlight and Microbial Interactions. I'd like to give you a brief overview of how the Polar Trek project relates to my NetLogo model, and references for both Rose's research and the Polar Trek program may be found on the information tab in the NetLogo model program. Why should we study polar regions? Earth's climate is changing most quickly in polar regions, and if you notice in the picture of the temperature anomalies, the greatest differences are seen in the polar regions, especially the Arctic polar regions. This change in temperature and change in climate has many impacts, including loss of sea ice, and it's affecting permafrost. There are over 9 million miles globally of permafrost around the world, and permafrost is a very active ecosystem, not just a white frozen wasteland as some students think. Permafrost is soil that remains frozen for at least 2 years, and one of the things we measured was depth of permafrost, and this was about 3 centimeters, so a very shallow active layer that still could support a lot of plant life. As plants and animals in the past have lived on tundra and then died, their carbon gets absorbed into the soil, and then the soil later on gets released into the atmosphere through many geochemical changes that happen. And Rose's research is looking at that rate of change and how sunlight influences that rate of change and release of carbon dioxide. So organic matters and chemical profiles are taken of water columns. The amount of light going through a water column is also measured, and then bacteria through a watershed are also measured and identified. And keep in mind that in the Arctic, in the summer, there's 24 hours of sunlight. This was a picture of sunlight in about midnight. Here's the NetLogo model that I created to try to describe the research going on, and you can find that under the heading Interaction of Sunlight and Bacteria. To explain the model, and again this is a very simplified model, the green bars representing the active layer where plants are growing right now on the permafrost. The teal kind of color is the permafrost layer, and then blue is representing the watershed. What I will work to improve is how the watershed is better represented. The water here looks like it's the bottom layer below the permafrost, when actually it should be shown more accurately moving through the permafrost. Okay, so on the model, what you can control is the amount of sunlight, and you can change that by changing the slider. So let's just set this in the middle, and notice then as this changes, you'll select amount of sunlight, click Setup, and what appears are carbon molecules that are trapped in the permafrost. Notice as the program runs, you'll get a ticker showing the amount of CO2 and get a plot looking at the amount of carbon released. So notice the sun is coming out, carbon is being released, permafrost is thawing, and that's being shown by a change of color in the permafrost layer. Carbon is moving into the water, and then bacteria is formed. These things are representing bacteria. Carbon dioxide is being released back into the atmosphere. So what you can change is the amount of sunlight. Again, start with the amount of sunlight that comes out. Notice the slope. Notice how quickly the amount of CO2 rises. If we decrease sunlight, click Setup, go from the start, and go. Notice the sunlight the amount of CO2 is slower. increase the amount of increase the amount of sunlight. Click Setup. Carbon and original carbon stays the same. Pay attention to the slope though. Carbon production increases much more rapidly as sunlight increases. And that's the point of the research and the point of the model, to show the relationship between sunlight and carbon dioxide formation. Increased sunlight seems to prompt the bacteria to oxidize carbon and form CO2, which travels through the watershed into the Arctic Ocean to be stored in the ocean or released into the atmosphere. Thanks.